Alex, it seems like every one of our episodes brings multiple firsts for us and our listeners, and I guess that's part of the adventure. We have so many firsts today. This is the original Hidden History Happy Hour video episode. And for those of you who have looked at our caricatures and wondered, how realistic are those? Alex is obviously better looking than his caricature, and then there's me. And today, though, we're classing up the joint, aren't we, Alex?
My gosh, aren't we just?
Yeah, we have another amazing first today. We have, if you can imagine such a thing, 2 first female doctors on our show. Alex has a great story where he'll introduce the first female doctor in a certain context. And we have a first female doctor with us to discuss not only her take on Alex's story, but her own history with the first person in her family to go to college and get a PhD. Everybody, our friend of the podcast, Nicole Fisher Roberts. Doctor, welcome.
Hey, Nicole.
Hi. Hey, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
And Nicole has her own podcast, the Global Good Podcast, which I highly recommend. It's uplifting in these times, which I think we need. And Nicole is the executive director of Feed a Billion, which we hope she'll talk about. And she has also, as a bonus, written a series of essays about the first mothers of America. Nicole, tell us about yourself.
Well, I mean, I think you just did. Yeah. But so my background's in neuroscience and then my doctorate's in public health. I mostly work globally, but obviously I know you guys, Brian, because we work together, thanks to you putting together a nonprofit task force during the pandemic. And I love history. And in fact, you mentioned my podcast, and it wasn't until I was listening to some of your episodes in the past couple of months that I realized how much of our show is rooted in history. It's just, you take it for granted in situations. Yeah. And so I loved hearing the way you guys structure your, storytelling and the way you converse with guests. And there's lots of things I want to take away. But
thank you very much. That's really good to hear.
Yeah, so I'm thrilled to be here.
As Alex likes to hear me say, 1,000% enthusiastic.
Your disrespect for mathematics is just so upsetting.
I like to think of it as planned ignorance, but in any event, Alex, why don't you tell us our story and we'll get Nicole's thoughts on it.
All right. Okay. I was going to tell the story from my book, Lessons from History, as we're on video for the first time.
Wait, hold on. If people that think that I just fake my way through it, this thing is dog-eared. It's annotated. Someday we'll give away my annotated copy because I've got lots of notes in here commenting on your stories.
Well, thanks, Brian. So this is one of the stories actually that provoked the most reaction online. Nicole, as you know, I started telling the stories on Twitter, where many of them, some of them I've told in the book aren't on Twitter, but those that are still there, and there's still hundreds of comments and exchanges about what they mean in history. But this one particularly took off, in part because there was some interesting discussion about whether I got it right and whether my conclusion was right. So here goes. As we tell it in history, conventionally, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was the first woman in Britain who qualified to be a doctor, to be a physician. And it's with trepidation that I suggested on Twitter and in my book that this widely held belief is actually wrong. Instead, I point to someone who was born in Ireland, graduating from the University of Edinburgh's Medical School in 1812 and passed the Royal College of Surgeons examination in 1813. This person, Dr. James Barry, I haven't made a mistake, Dr. James Barry was Inspector General of the British Army, which is the second highest position in our military to which a doctor can rise. It's equivalent to a brigadier general. After joining the army, Barry was posted to Cape Town, formed a close relationship with the governor of the Cape, Lord Charles Somerset, and after successfully treating his daughter, who was very sick. Barry had a 10-year stint in the Cape, performing what was probably the first cesarean section in Africa in which the mother and child both survived. It was really interesting. There's a clutch of people in history after that who are named James Barry after that doctor, and because they were delivered successfully by cesarean, including James Barry Hertzog, who went on to become Prime Minister of South Africa. So it's really interesting, people living with the legacy of James Barry. So really kind of eventful life in medicine. Barry argued throughout time in medicine with Florence Nightingale, fought a duel with pistols against the captain of the Light Dragoons, caught yellow fever in the West Indies, dealt with a cholera outbreak in Malta, and wherever Barry went in the empire, he was a pain for his superiors and a reassuring figure for those who served with him, because he always pushed for improvements in the treatment of soldiers in their diet and the way that they were looked after medically. So what I think you ask, point is that Barry was born a woman, not revealed until after death, when Barry's body was laid out. British Army, which at that time did not require medical examination for people who joined up as officers, sealed Barry's records, and they remained sequestered for over 100 years. Of course, finally came to light that James Barry was a woman who had been born Margaret Ann Bulkley, and had successfully lived as a man from 1809 until death in 1865, thereby gaining access to medical school, graduating, serving in the forces, helping thousands of people through medicine and advances in hygiene, and living a life of adventure to the full. And of course, the point is that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson received her medical license in 1865, fully 50 years after James Barry, Margaret Ann Bulkley qualified. And I consider these examples together, and I thought, well, what do I make of this? My point: sometimes unjustifiable prejudices can stop you living your life as you would wish to live them, and you can protest and you can subvert. They are different responses, but they are both reasonable responses, and it's up to you. And of course, otherwise, James Barry, Margaret Ann Bulkley would not have got to have been a doctor. So that's my story.
Well, Alex, this lives up to our promise on the podcast of stories that are incredible, but also true at the same time. And much the same as Nicole's story of getting her doctorate. Now, bear in mind, I can't do math, as I just proved, but this is 150 some years later or more, maybe more. Nicole, what was your experience? Well, first of all, what's your thoughts about the story, and what was your experience in becoming a doctor yourself?
Well, obviously, that's a remarkable story. And it is amazing to think about. And now we have all these terms, and we talk about like code switching and all these things we do, right, to fit into a place and a time and sort of mold ourselves to what we should be or think we need to be to fit into an environment. It's just fascinating when you look back and like, that feels dirty enough, right, to change who you are,
right,
to have to do that,
to live the majority of your entire life as a wholly different human being,
right,
is remarkable. Just I mean, the energy, I can't even imagine the energy it takes, plus to be that brilliant and cunning, and it's an absolutely fascinating story.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the experience of having to live undercover for a time and just have the wherewithal to fake everything about my professional life and my personal life, much less having to fake my gender, which would honestly probably be impossible for me. But the day-to-day stress of that had to be crazy. Alex, do we know anything about the life that she lived outside of being a doctor? Probably not, right?
Quite a little, actually, because there was two things. First of all, famously held people at arm's length and didn't form many friendships, which you might think fits in with the notion of trying to keep this lifelong falsehood on the road. But on the other hand, as I was implying as I tell the story, very close to Somerset, the governor general of South Africa. And at that time, that was widely speculated about in the Boer and South African society that these two men were improperly close. And ironically, it might actually have been a more conventional relationship than the scandal mongers had it, except it was not, of course, on the other hand. So I think
this is layers upon layers of complexity.
It's very difficult to wrap your head around it. It reminds me of Shrek. Onions are not whatever. No, it's ogres are not like cakes. That's what it is.
Parfait. Nobody don't like parfait.
Nobody doesn't like parfait.
Exactly.
But so we think, Alex, that potentially they had what would have been considered at the time conventional relationship, although they weren't married, which would have been an issue. But it was a scandal because she
disguised
couldn't
and suspected as an unconventional relationship, wrapped up. Yeah.
Wow. I'm sure there's a Kardashian tie-in somewhere in here, but I can't quite reach it. Nicole, tell us your story, because your story occurs so many decades later, but you still encountered some of the same issues. Am I right?
Yes. Well, I think women often encounter some. I mean, it depends on where you work, who you work with, right? There's a lot about the context and the environment. Academia, medicine, they've not advanced as quickly as some other fields. For me, as you were telling that story, I actually had a couple of things come to mind. And what I find really interesting about the two examples that come to mind of just when I was left in like speechless they both involve other women. And I'm wondering, so now I'm playing this out in real time in my head. Like, I wonder if it's because so much of what happens when you hear something from a man, like it's kind of expected, where you're like, someone else, I heard this. But the two examples that came to my mind, first was even when I was applying for my doctorate, and I won't certainly name schools. And I had an interview.
But they were in the United States, yeah?
Yeah, both were US. One, I remember going to this doctoral interview, and I met the dean, and we were sitting in her office, and she just came right out and asked me if I planned on having a family. And
get out. What, Nicole, what year was this? What decade?
2004.
Oh my goodness.
Almost certainly unlawful. I mean, I'm not particularly familiar with the American regulations.
But no, it was
2006.
Right. In the UK.
Yeah. Oh, either way. Oh no, either way, this is, it might've been 2006. I'm having a hard time. Like, it was
but it's unlawful for sure.
Oh yeah. And it's just the two of us in her office, and I'm sitting across from her, and she says, "Do you plan on having, a family?" And at that time, I had no clue. I mean, it wasn't even, I had just started dating someone. Like, in no world was I family planning. But the point is, I think I said, well, I don't know. I'm finishing my master's degree. When I graduate in a couple of months, I'm thinking about what comes next. And as I said, my background's in neuroscience, and I knew I wanted to get a doctorate, but I was struggling, sort of where I wanted to exactly apply that academic rigor. And anyway, in the end, she ended up saying, well, I just want to warn you that if you were to come in and we were to, structure these things and this mentor and this person and blah, blah, blah around, you, that, if you ever did, even in pursuing tenure, she said, you'd have to time out, stop your clock, and you don't want to be that girl, do you?
Oh, good.
And it was left there, just like on the desk, like, you don't want to be that girl, do you? I just remember sitting there terrified, like, I have no freaking clue. Like, I'm just trying to figure, like, I just want to get into school. I don't know.
Right. Well, so
I had never until that moment thought about stopping clocks in 10 years from that point on. Like, it was completely foreign to me, but I just went, holy shit.
Well, two things about that, Nicole. One, it's amazing that was 2004. And I know you have another story that is perhaps equally appalling, but I'll just mention someone who was once very close to me in the 90s, was a lawyer in Wisconsin, and was arguing a construction law case. And at the end, the judge said on the record, publicly elected official said on the record, honey, tell your client next time, don't send a woman to do a man's job.
Yikes.
There's
a transcript of that.
Yeah.
Is it framed? Did she print this thing out?
But so is Nicole's story, so my God.
Frame it?
So what about your second one then, Nicole?
Yeah,
but before you get to that, give us a little background about your family and how you went to college in the first place and your background.
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Louisiana, Baton Rouge.
Carville country.
Carville country. Yeah. Like very close, like same parish.
Wow.
And then I've lived with my dad my whole life since I was 2. And so my daddy's family see if I drink too much, I have the Southern accent that comes out.
Hey, so does Alex, which is bizarre.
Well,
I don't know what the Southern England accent is, but he has it.
But have you ever noticed though, like the drunker you get, sometimes like you develop like some kind of like
Absolutely.
English accent too? Like it's really weird that we do that.
Yes, I definitely get an English accent when I drink.
It's probably not at all annoying to English people when Americans do that either, I'm sure.
Oh, no, we love your impressions of us. Wonderful.
I'll save that for another time then.
Fair.
Yeah, but so when I was about 2, we moved to Missouri, southern the Ozark Mountains, where my dad's family was from. And so I grew up there. And I was the first person to go to college. I went to Mizzou. And then I won't name names after that, just because some of these stories apply to places I've been and worked over the years. So
so what was your family's response to your college and then doctoral ambitions?
Varied.
Yeah.
I grew up, I was lucky enough that when you grow up in the Ozark Mountains, college isn't something, at least, back then, that people talked about a lot. It wasn't part of conversation. It
was the same in rural Ohio where I grew up. The guidance counselors thought they were scoring a big coup if they could get you to go to the 2-year technical college in my hometown.
Right. And so I consider myself very lucky in that my dad framed school in a way that was always, when you go to college. Awesome. From my earliest memories, he would say, well, when you go to college, this, or when you go to, and he had never been, right. But he always just sort of had this aspiration. For me, by the time I was, middle school, high school, it was like, well, of course, that's what you do. And that's not the same for everyone around there. On the flip side, I can tell you, when I did start my doctorate, or when I finally chose a university for my doctorate, my grandmother, bless her heart, she asked me when I was going to stop doing that silly school thing and get married. But their definitions of success are different. And
well,
marriage and children are success.
I have to ask, was that bless your heart? Was that the traditional Southern bless your heart, which really means fuck off?
When she told me to stop the silly school thing, yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I felt and feel about it. I'm very happy with how things shook out for me. But I also understand, and she didn't finish high school. So
of course,
for her, for me to keep putting off things that she considered to be top priority, which is security, husband, marriage, children, I just kept going. I'm like, oh, I'm done with this one, so I'm going to go do that one. And then when I was doing my terminal degree, there was some shuffling. I said, oh, well, then I'll finish doing this other terminal degree. Like, it was just, for me, I just kept going. Right. And so, she reached a point where she was just like, how long are we going to do this?
How long are you going to do this? But that story, Nicole, is really interesting to listen to, because of course she loved you and you loved her.
Oh yeah.
And she was still deeply wrong about something, and that can happen in life. And think of all the people who don't have your strength or your purpose, or didn't have your dad's counsel and support in doing what you did, and so forth. And it's in a different context, but those people go through what George Bush Jr. used to call the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yeah,
and they apply to people up and down my country and yours. Not necessarily that they couldn't go to university and couldn't better themselves in that way and couldn't therefore expand their earning opportunities and so forth, but that nobody really thinks it's for them, and therefore they're not encouraged to or empowered to.
Right.
And it's not always intentional, right? It's just people reacting to their own upbringing. I had a girlfriend in high school, and I grew up in a very kind of poor, lower middle class, small town. And in 2016, when my mother was dying of COPD, this girl, now obviously a 50-something woman, contacted me and said, "Can I go see your mother?" And I said, of course. It was 90 miles from where I grew up. And I went and I met this woman, and we sat with my mom. And she told this story that I had never known. She said to my mother, she took her hand and she said, "Gretchen, you're the reason I went to college. My parents had two children, a boy and a girl. And this is in the 80s. Like, this is not ancient history. And they only focused on, first of all, they weren't sold on college anyway. And they only focused on it for my brother. And if it weren't for me coming to your house and you encouraging me to go to college, I never would have gone. And I never would have been a registered nurse, and I never would have saved people's lives. And I had no idea about that. That I learned that more or less on my mother's deathbed. But the ripples that you send through history by the way you behave, that's kind of a theme of our podcast. And your story fits right in with that. But tell us about the other hurdle you had to overcome.
Well, I want to stay there for 1 second just to say, like, it's so remarkable also to then reflect upon how many people in the last few years I've mentored. And to be a doctor of public health during a pandemic has been very revealing in many ways, good and bad.
And let me say, your participation in our nonprofit No COVID was pivotal to the success of it. And thanks again for that.
Compared to the John Barrys of the world, I doubt that, but thank you.
Not James Barry, John Barry.
John Barry, one of your previous guests. But I also but my point in bringing that up just quickly is to say, how many people are looking at getting, say, a master's or doctorate in public health or health policy or something? And I've actually said, are you sure? Are you sure this is a path you want to go down? Because there are so many other ways to have impact and have influence in your community. Mm-hmm. And it may not be another graduate degree or a graduate degree at all, right? Academia was my path. It may not be other people's. And so I would like to think this pendulum sort of keeps swinging, but we are in a place where you can be wildly successful for all the right, good reasons, and influential. And it could be college. It may not be. It could be something completely different. And I hope we're in a place where younger people feel like they have options, and it's not just there's only one path to success.
I hope that's true. And in my country, we're trying hard to improve not just the existence and availability, but the status of apprenticeships and people serving apprentices, and should be proud of them, and improving our technical colleges, because people should have the opportunities apart from university and college should be just as good in their way as the universities and colleges are. So,
look at all the
we're
jobs
working on that too.
Lost in the last couple of years in particular, and yet especially from where I do, every person who's a plumber or has these like trade skills, they're just fine.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Oh, right? Well, at least fine.
They're all actually doing exceptionally well. They have skills that a lot of us do not have, that are irreplaceable to the infrastructure and day-to-day life of all of us. And so I love your point. Like, the fact that we would in any way, whether it's media or whatever, like assign less pride or dignity to something is silly. Absolutely silly. They are such important, players in life.
So we're recording this in early May of 2022, and I can't help but reflect on how horrible everything that Vladimir Putin is doing is. But I will say one, and this will be the only time you ever hear me say this, listeners, one positive thing about the old Soviet Union, and that is they valued the school teacher, the cleaning crew, the maintenance people on the subway as much as they valued the medical doctor, the lawyer, the physicist. And that was a very low value for everyone, but at least they recognized that those skills were equally important. And honestly, now I have two daughters, 23 and 21, and thank God they never considered it. Alex and I are sort of recovering lawyers. I would never tell them in 2022 to go to law school. I mean, the ROI there is just not what it was 25 years ago. But tell us about the mascara story, please.
Yeah. Well, it actually plays right into what Alex was saying just a minute ago. So the second story that came to mind, and you've heard this story, Brian, obviously. I was working on my doctorate. I had built this micro simulation model, and the woman who was in charge of we called them concentrations, but was decision sciences. I was combining public health and neuroscience, thinking about how people
Pretty
behave.
pretty timely, as it turns out.
Yeah, it worked out well for me. And she called me into her office, and I remember thinking, like, I've fucked this up royally.
Substantively,
like
in some way, yeah.
Right. Like there's something in my model, there's something in my dissertation, there's something that is just like sweating. Right.
Right.
And I go, she shuts the door, we sit down, and I'm like, I don't know. I've looked at this thing so many times. I've reread. I don't know what I could have done this wrong. And to Alex's point, I know in real time I was angry, but I also realized she was trying to protect me. She was taking her experiences and trying to be kind in her own way.
And this is still the early 2000s, yeah?
Yeah, I was working with my doctor. And she said to me, essentially, I am afraid you won't be taken seriously in your career. And I think you have a lot of potential, but I can't help but notice that you wear mascara.
By the way, Alex has the same problem in his career.
And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I was thinking about what was in my model, right? And she is, essentially came to the point of like, I don't want you to, you're going to be working with a lot of particularly older men. I don't want you trying to look like you're trying too hard to be like a cute girl or something to that effect, right? And she said that in her opinion and experience, that wearing makeup was a hindrance to being taken
like
seriously.
A red flag, yeah.
And in my case, she couldn't help but notice that I wore mascara, which I am totally wearing right now. Thanks. And that was it. Like, that was it. The end of meeting. And I left and I'm texting friends, like, what them? Because a couple of my friends knew how like scared I was.
Yeah, you were worried about substantial things. Yeah.
And I was like, you will never believe what this meeting was actually about. And we've made jokes about it over the years. I still have a couple of friends who make jokes. But, Alex, I do think you made a good point of like, she had applied for tenure and not gotten it.
Uh-huh.
And she had a long academic career, very smart woman. And I still have really, really mixed feelings about that conversation, because I do believe it was actually coming from a place of love.
Right.
Did you change anything, Nicole, or did you keep on keeping on?
I am embarrassed to say I did stop pretty much wearing makeup for a while.
Good grief. It really
because even though it made me angry and I was like,
you just wanted to tick the box. This was a person of influence over your immediate career, right?
Yeah. I mean, so on the committee, she was, very influential. And not just to make her happy, it actually shook me. I would go to things, and especially once I moved to DC shortly after, I would often be the only female in the room. I've been handed the coffee tray so many times, right?
So
it stuck with me. Like, it sat with me. And even now you can hear it and see it how like worked up I get talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like
so now, Nicole, it's 2022. You've started this amazing podcast. You've worked to help mitigate COVID problems with us. You've fed a bunch of people. You have your PhD. How does her comments stick with you even now? Or maybe they don't. Maybe you're over.
No, they do. I mean, given how worked up I just got, clearly something sticks. I think one, I do try to not so much put my personal experiences on younger people that I talk to.
Because you mentor people too.
Yeah. And when I do, I try to at least own it. Of like, look, this is my experience. I don't know, especially with the way technology is advancing, right? I'm like, experiences are so different now. I also think I have to sometimes still talk myself into being myself.
Yeah.
Which feels a little shameful, right? As an adult. But like I'm lucky enough that people sometimes often pay me to moderate and MC events, things like that. And I did this huge healthcare event in Vegas, and I wore leather pants on stage, which sounds kind of silly, but I had to give myself like a pep talk.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm in Vegas. I'm like, this thing is supposed to be fun. It's in all neon colors. The purpose of this is to not be in a suit,
right?
Yeah.
Not do these things. And I just said, yeah, I'm going to do it. So I wore a blazer, I had to balance it out, right? So I did like a button down and a blazer, but I wore black leather pants. And it sounds small and kind of silly, but I'm like, the fact that I had to stand there and give myself a pep talk.
Yeah, think about it. Yeah,
that it's okay. I have permission to wear something I want to wear.
Well, I for one,
like that just doesn't go away.
I for one will be wearing leather pants at our June 6th and 7th events in New York, and really nobody wants to see that. So we're gonna have a barrier in front of the table. So
there goes my attendance. So, yeah. Hey, Nicole, I want to ask you something about your last story, because you said as just a throwaway, you said I still have a couple of friends who make jokes. Yeah. Is it as bad as that now in the US that people can't possibly make a joke anymore for fear of the joke police?
Yeah, that's a problem. What do you think, Nicole?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's a real problem. I also, this is a trusted circle of friends, of girlfriends, and we've shared a lot of experiences. They were the people who, when I left that meeting, sent like a text, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
We have our own language and conversation, and some of them knew this woman. And so like we have our own thoughts, opinions. And so for us, it's a safe space. There are obviously, I think, some real issues. And you guys mentioned it on, I don't remember one of your episodes, but I remember you talking about, I think it was the Greek history one, but
with Michael.
Yeah.
Mike, yeah, with a Y.
Michael the Y.
Yeah, the bronze lie. Yeah.
But talking about like cancel culture and things of that nature. And it was, I remember listening to, I'm pretty sure it was that one, because it was interesting just to hear about like how people and accountability and how myths and legends and things sort of come forward. I think my favorite part of that episode, though, and it stuck with me and I laughed really hard, was when Alex, you asked the question specifically, like, what did I get
What
right
did he
or
get wrong in his story? Yeah.
And he very politely talked for like 5 minutes about the power of storytelling.
Power of stories.
And how even if it's not right, they hold value. And you'd mentioned the Bible or something. And then very quickly he goes, but you're not right.
Yeah, it's all incorrect.
You're completely wrong.
Yeah.
But it's still power.
Well, this is
the sweetest letdown.
Yeah,
ever.
Wasn't it just? I don't know if you see. He just gave me the bad feedback sandwich. Like, oh, you look really nice today. This piece of work was terrible. I'm looking forward to seeing you later for a drink.
Yeah, it was great.
But this is the thing, right? I mean, just because something isn't factually accurate does not mean it is not true. And these stories affect people. People live their lives by the Bible, by the Quran, by these other sacred texts. And I've beaten this horse to death already in prior episodes, but in some ways it doesn't matter whether it's true. What matters is what you take away from it and how you live your life based on it.
I'm gonna agree and disagree.
Do it, especially the disagree part.
Yeah, so I agree. Right. And the values and the value systems that we hold each other to it, like culturally, that matters, right? Whether it's the Bible, the Quran, whatever, like those stories serve a very strong bonding purpose. Great. You mentioned way back at the intro, like I had actually written a few pieces.
Yes.
A 5-part series on women in history. And so when I hear you say that, and I think it's because you primed me by mentioning that I write global public health and whatnot for Forbes and other sites. But that was just this weird quirk one-off series I did. And the reason I'm going to disagree with you on this is because I wrote that series because of how angry I was
Yes. Mm-hmm.
at history being misrepresented.
Yeah.
And it started with someone, I have no idea. I mean, I live in DC.
I'm sure it was a guy.
So,
Just
weirdly enough, like Ben Franklin just comes up in conversation, and someone was talking about the post office and something. I don't remember. What I do remember is they had framed the period in history. And I remember thinking, I'm pretty sure he was like in France.
Yep.
Right.
Like
He
getting
was at one point,
STDs at that time. Like that was not what.
He was your ambassador to France, and it was a very important, very exceptionally important posting, which of course led to your very first alliance.
Yes, so not to downplay that part. but,
And the STDs,
Yeah.
well, okay, there's all that is very important to history. But what I had gotten hung up on was, I'm like, what about Deborah Franklin,
Yeah.
who was actually here doing the work?
Yeah.
And so I wrote this piece on sort of like the forgotten women, and I did a whole series, and I don't even remember all of them, but I know like I did Sybil, Londington, Ogden, and some others. And the purpose was really like the fact that in that article, I even had to say Sybil is
Yeah.
the
'Cause no one's heard.
female Paul
Mhm.
Revere.
Yep.
Irritated me so
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
that I had to give her male counterpart in history for people to even understand sort of
Yeah.
the context of what she was doing and when and how and why, letting people know who was coming on a horse mattered.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the stories,
Well,
the myths, the legends, they do matter, but sometimes the history matters too, because we completely wiped out all these women who helped found this country because the men told some good stories.
well, so tell
I
us.
disagree with you, Brian, for different reasons. I think that
Jesus Christ, I'm never having another guest on.
I think that cultural mores hold very little force if they're not not rooted in something somebody actually believes. If you're tipping the hat to something saying this is obviously not actually true, but I go along with it in the way that we tell stories to children, it holds no binding moral force over the people concerned. The smarter and braver thing to do, if you have moved, for example, from a faith-based society to a non-faith-based society, is to establish a new set of norms that you coalesce around. And, that will be contested and people agree and disagree about what those norms should be. But I think that admiring moral codes or systems or stories because they may have some kind of worth, even though people don't believe in the things that root them, it doesn't really work.
Well, look, I'm the guy who is heavily lobbying to write the Constitution for Mars. Elon Musk, if you're listening, I'm your Alexander Hamilton. And I'm only halfway kidding about that. That's going to be Lord of the Flies up there if somebody doesn't think about that. But I just don't agree. Maybe I'm outnumbered now, which is okay. I don't agree that you should forget all the lessons from the past to create the lessons for the future.
Nobody was arguing, neither Nicole nor I were arguing we should forget the lessons from history at all.
No, I don't think we should forget.
Well, Nicole, talk to us about the founding mothers a little more.
I mean, look at like the Abigail Adams of the world, right? One thing that I think makes a lot of the stories of the women of the revolution sort of stand out is lack of education.
Yeah.
Getting back to what we were talking about earlier, because these are women who, by marrying who they did, they often grew up already, right, in privileged families, but they still weren't allowed to read and write and go to school like their brothers.
Because they were women. Yeah.
Because they were women. And so
like
they,
in Afghanistan now.
Right. And so they were, told to aspire to marriage. All of these women could read and could write. They would, in the case of like Eliza Pinckney, when her dad, I think when he brought her to the States, she was 15, maybe. And at 16, she was handed all the family's properties and said, make a go of it. Right. And if you go all the way back, I would say she's absolutely instrumental, not only by being married to the Pinckneys, but having 2 sons who went on to do things like sign the Declaration. She read all of her father's law books many times over. She would marry people. She would divorce people. She did all kinds of things at the time that just because she was the only person there. And so she said, well, we'll figure it out. Right. And she'd read books and she'd do these things. And she's the one who in South Carolina started planting indigo. And she said, if we're going to win this war, we have to be able to make money. We need to make money off the crown. And the way we can do that is by selling them indigo. And so now we've got Indigo Run and all these stunningly beautiful places in the South. Wow. And she was 15, 16 years old. And yet, we talk about the people that are 2, 3 removed from her, right, who have, done also remarkable things, but without her, none of those other things or people would have existed.
Well, what made you pissed off enough to write this series on women of the American Revolution? By the way, which Alex views as like the war of American aggression or whatever. But what made you start this
discussion? You guys can still come home.
Oh, I love that.
You guys,
I love it. I especially loved it in 2016, but I love it now. Anyway, go ahead.
We have had strong female leadership in my country since 1952.
That is true.
I think the reason I started that series was out of frustration, but what frustrated me was, living here in DC for over a decade, much longer. We sit in this weird place, both in our own country and then abroad, of how we're seen, how we're viewed. And here it's so common to find people who are new. I mean, I think we're the most transient city in the US, but I think, like I had mentioned, Deborah Franklin was the sort of catalyst, and someone was talking about Ben Franklin. And it's just, people will often, I tend to think it's the newer people to the district who will mention history in a way as though it like just started.
Right.
Yes.
Like when they moved to DC is somehow like when history started, or when a certain president did something. That's when history. But like I live a couple blocks from the Postal Museum. Yeah. Right. So in this particular case, like people were talking about it, and I'm like, you just gotta walk 2 blocks.
Right. Open your eyes on the street.
It's free. Like it's you can learn about this. This is not hard. I
would say about your city that whatever one thinks of it and whether people like it as a city or not, I happen to like it very much, but it is the most improved city I've known in my lifetime. I think since I first started going in the 90s, it's improved in cleanliness. It's improved in cleanliness.
Restaurants.
For quality of food you can and drink you can get, the quality of jobs, the quality of housing, the nightlife, all of those things. I just think it's probably the most improved city that I've known.
Yep. And that's not to say we haven't also made big mistakes. Gentrification is real. This city has lost beautiful neighborhoods and pockets for the sake of advancement, and it's a shame.
That's true in London too.
Yeah, and at the same time, there are improvements that have happened that I hope continue to draw in smart, thoughtful people, because we are 700,000-800,000 people strong. And that's not counting Maryland and Virginia and all the people that come in. Right. And we run nonprofits. We try and solve problems. The people who actually get elected, they don't live here. They live wherever they're elected, and they come here. They're just visitors. So they don't represent us at all.
It feels like you should have an actual vote in Congress, which, has been on the table for a long time. You know the history of the district, right? So the history of the District of Columbia is that in the early days, no one wanted a particular American state to have dominion over the national government. So they went to Maryland and Virginia and they said, give us some land that we can put our capital on. And they gave them the shittiest land they could possibly find. I mean, it's, first of all, yes, it's a reclaimed swamp. Second of all, mosquitoes. Third of all, it's the worst place in the world to visit in April if you have allergies. Am I right?
Oh, it's beautiful though. But yes.
But yeah,
The cherry blossoms are beautiful.
Exactly.
But yes,
That's what I was.
No, and then summer is like 100.
Summer was where and
you know why it's
hot.
called the swamp for many reasons. Yeah, no, it's just
when I worked there, I would have to keep like multiple shirts in my offices because I couldn't get there without having to throw a shirt away. So, but Nicole, you're podcasting for two, as I understand it. You have a baby boy on the way. Congratulations. Awesome.
Many congratulations.
Thank you. Which for those watching, since you are doing video this time, I'm drinking a non-alcoholic wine, but I wanted to be like part of
the gang.
Yeah. I am not, but cheers.
See, I still have a need to fit in. Well, I still do.
Yes. Brian was talking about a series of firsts. This is episode 15. This is the first podcast we've recorded when I'm not drinking. We're doing that because I am still nursing a hangover from yesterday.
Nicole, first of all, this has been amazing. I couldn't have planned a better first guest if I had planned it, which I did. But what do you think 100 years from now, historians are going to say about the role of women, not just in government, but also in NGOs and in the media? How are we doing? Are we failing still, or are we making progress?
I certainly think we're making progress. I mean, history is long, right? We've made a lot of progress in each lifetime. So it doesn't always feel that way. I think there are certain arenas in which we have done a lot better than others. Mm-hmm. When earlier we were talking about medicine, things that I think we're doing much better, right? Like you mentioned, I'm podcasting for two, right? My OBGYN, all my doctors, by pure coincidence, I didn't select them, right? They're all these brilliant women that I trust clearly my life and my child's life with, right? So we're definitely making advancements. At the same time, Alex mentioned, how long they've had women in leadership positions and things. We still haven't gotten there.
No, we haven't.
There's still a lot to be done. And I hope we reach a place where we don't even have to ask that question anymore. But
let me ask you this, though. And now we're going to get a bit edgy, like we do. Do you feel that we've had the right women running, but there's still this okay, you answered my question. Expand, please, on that.
Oh dear.
Let me just tell you what I believe in. You can react.
You help me with this one.
I think the American people are ready for a woman president. They're just not ready for the woman that has run for president. Your thoughts?
Yes.
Well,
can that be the answer?
It can. As an outsider, I would say your country did this remarkable thing. It found the almost one in person, or one of the very few who could lose a presidential election to Donald Trump.
100%.
And the Republicans put up someone who nearly lost to Hillary Clinton. I mean, these are both remarkable achievements, all on the same ballot.
Right. Yes. So really, yes was the answer to,
yes, the answer
both
is yes.
Everything that you both have said. I think, but I also sit in a very non or bipartisan position. So like the 5-part series, A Women in History that you mentioned, that was published in the Federalist. And it was the Federalist who reached out and said, like, we would love a Women in History, great. Public
Nicole, can I just say what a weird thing that is, right? So the Federalist is considered in the United States to be the preeminent right-wing conservative lawyers association. So the fact that they reach out to you kind of means something, right?
I mean, I know their founder. This is something else when we were talking about DC. DC's small.
Right.
And up until the last, I don't even know exactly what time frame to put on it, but I would say few years, less than 10 easily. anyone who lives outside of here who really thought like it's left versus right, they hate each other. It's theater, it's a show, right? Everybody knows everybody. We all have dinner together. We have lots of debates that probably don't happen at dinner parties, other places.
Right.
But we all get along. We all respect each other. It's only been in the last few years, whatever that window is, where those conversations have stopped. And I would say people really do not cross the aisle, or they think other people are, just cannot associate with. So for me, it was
much for the worse, right? Much for the worse.
Oh, much for the worse. Yeah. And so for me, it doesn't matter when someone says, we'd love for you to explore this, and I write about public health, I'm like, yes, let me dig into this. It was easily one of the things that helped launch my podcast in a way. And, to me, history has no political party, certainly not in our two-party system in the US. And public health is the same way. It has no party. It doesn't belong to anyone. And that's part of why I think we've failed so epically in the 2 years of the pandemic. People have, at least in the US, and I've seen it in other countries play out where I work, but in the US in particular, like, we've had parties try to own public health, or and there are reasons, right? But it's silly, and it's to the detriment of all of us.
Yeah. Tell me about, you were saying you live in a small town. It's a small world. I know the folks at the Federalist Society really well as well. Funny. I had a closing question, if it's okay.
Do it, Alex.
Because you were talking about your professional role and that public health responsibility that you have alongside the nonprofit and so forth. And there's this very interesting history of conditions. And I just wanted to invite you to talk about, tuberculosis being spread by books and what it meant for the public record and public history and libraries. And
yes, you guys have to come on my show.
Done.
It's new. It's a new podcast. I've only done 10 episodes, but it started out doing an interview each week with someone much like you guys do. And the reason earlier I said I'd never thought of it as a history podcast. I think of it as travel, adventure, but like doing good. It's supposed to be action oriented. But I now see how much history is in it, because like the one I did in Rwanda, for someone to understand how remarkable it is that their country, until just a few years ago, had one vision clinic for the entire country, to where they are now, where everyone can access vision care. You have to go back to genocide, and you have to go back to the 90s and understand a little bit of what happened, because that played out in why the healthcare system ended up the way it did. Yeah. And so all of our episodes are that way. When, the one we talk about food security and Feed a Billion, the nonprofit I run, you've got to start back with cultural norms in India and how the caste system shaped sort of these things. So I just want to say how much more, after talking to you, I'm like appreciating the history aspect of the podcast. But so that leads to, I did an episode because tuberculosis is not sexy. But I had gotten very interested in libraries, and I went down this rabbit hole. And I said to myself, well, if this is based off of an episode, but I want to like dive down deep, why not just do every other episode that way? So I call them diversions. Right. It really is just a diversion from whatever we're talking about with a guest. And in that one, I started looking into the history of book burning in public libraries, and was shocked to see these periods of history that dovetailed. So, like all things with medicine and healthcare, the unintended consequences of people trying to do good. So essentially, the short story is both of our countries went hand in hand, literally jumped into the fire. We're trying to figure out where tuberculosis came from. Around the same time, public libraries were taking off around 100 years ago. And up until that point, only the wealthy elite controlled sort of the movement of books and education. And what happened is people got this notion that maybe TB was being spread by library books, because people were passing them back and forth. And for us, it really started in Nebraska, in Omaha, the public library there. A librarian, died of TB. And so it just the newspaper spread like wildfire.
What era was this? When was that?
Oh my gosh. I knew you were going to ask me that.
Because I think it's a World War I story.
It's right at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
And that's why I said I ballparked it. It was like 100 years ago. So I think it's right there. I'll have to look it up again.
Favorite ballparker, yeah.
But wouldn't you know, much like we just saw or still are seeing, I want to say the Chicago Tribune and one other publication within a matter of weeks found, isn't it remarkable, a couple of scientists and doctors who were disease spreading experts or something. They gave them,
of course,
But so the one that really changed things was the Chicago Tribune, and this had happened in Nebraska. Next thing you know, they're running articles scaring the shit out of people.
Of course,
that books were possibly the reason. So, then I had to stop and go, wait, why did no one who knew better do better?
Yeah.
And it all came back to, from my takeaway, the wealthy elite all of a sudden realized we're giving everyone an education for free. Like they could just go pick up books.
Yeah.
And now they're burning them down, the libraries. They're taking the books home and burning them. And they were like, we're not going to stop that. If they don't want to know. Why, if they don't want the leg up, hey, we're not going to give it to them. And so it went on and on for, easily 20 years longer than it should have.
But I guess to put a button on this whole discussion, Nicole, how should our listeners think about primary sources of history? Is it books? Is it podcasts? Is it how should we be looking at history right now?
I'm not 100% sure.
That's a good
I know
answer.
you posed that question to last week's guest.
No, it's a great answer.
But I will tell you, at the university level, there were discussions. One of my cohorts, we were the first millennials to get doctorates. And I remember having our cohort and the professor sitting down and having conversations about information. We were the first cohort of doctoral students that would have laptops and raise our hand and in real time say, yes, but according to this YouTube video from Stanford, right? And the teachers were like, I wrote this book. I wrote the examples. I'm teaching the course. Why are you over there Googling someone else's version of it?
Yeah.
And they said, we have a problem here. And so they actually back then started saying, maybe we need to teach a course on how to discern information. Yeah,
it's the archetypal definition of intellectual arrogance, right? Like they recognize it, which is good.
Yes, but I don't think we ever came to an answer. But what stood out to me in answering your question is, at some point we have to now teach. Yeah, because I do believe it's a skill of how to discern information. I have seen when I visit places, what people, I don't use Facebook, but like I've seen people scrolling and like what's on their screen. And to me, it's just a parody. Like I am in absolute shock but all you have to do is click that share button. It's so easy. You just hit it. Right?
Well, a fundamental principle, I think, of our podcast is that people should be learning from history, but should also be discerning and realize
question everything.
Yeah, 100%. What do you rely on for your sources of information day to day? I'm talking Axios. I'm talking intelligence feeds. Like, what informs your daily agenda?
I'm not as good anymore. I'll own that. I used to, particularly back when I worked like at the State Department or think tank. I would each morning I would read very opposing views. Now, again, being in DC, I had a bit of a luxury that, one, there's internet, but two, you can grab a newspaper from it, right? And you have the full spectrum of crazy to crazy. right? On both ends.
Right.
And everything in between. But I would go out of my way to, if I read, something in one place, to read the opposing idea, either, or I should say both, to know what my day was going to look like, especially when the Affordable Care Act was being passed.
Right. Yeah.
But then also to just see, like, here's how, back to that behavioral sort of, human decision-making aspect of how people are interpreting this information.
How pessimistic should we be?
Oh, I'm not as pessimistic as you.
You're definitely not.
I'm not. I am lucky that by especially hosting the Global Good podcast, I interview people who are doing the coolest shit in the world that make the world better.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and by the way, I expect to post a link to our appearance on your podcast, on this podcast.
There you go. But because I interview people who are just doing such cool, thoughtful things, it gives me lots of hope. It also means that, like, the interns and people who naturally congregate to me are people who are young and ambitious and aspirational. So I have been fortunate enough to be surrounded by a lot of those people, particularly during these tough times.
Yeah.
On the flip side, running something like Feed a Billion, on any given day, I'm having to deal with families choose between feeding their daughter or selling her.
Oh my God.
And so I kind of live in a dark place, if that makes sense.
No, it's sad, but it's true.
It is. And so I think my sort of baseline blood pressure is different than other people. That's certainly displayed itself during everything that's happening with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Brian, you probably know better than anyone what any given year, 8 to like something like 40,000 people, unarmed civilians, are killed by aggressors of some kind. And we do nothing. We don't bat an eyelash. And not saying that we shouldn't at this, but
it's absolutely mind-blowing how in 3 months we've transformed those numbers into orders of magnitude difference. I mean, we're talking about tank battles in Europe in 2022. That's crazy. You can't even really process it. But how is your nonprofit adjusting to that?
We're not doing much different, and not to knock
of course
people that I would say are new to the scene, but we've been feeding kids all over the world, girls all over the world for years, working with schools. When schools are out, we work with sport clubs. Football is the greatest way to feed a kid on earth, in my opinion, these days. Kids play no matter what. They don't have to speak the same language. And yet, we now have a conflict that people are looking at. And so you've got all these players popping up. Yes, these people need to be fed. Of course they need to be fed. Their children need to be safe and secure.
Yeah.
Where have they been? I mean, there are refugee camps that have existed for 40 years in Ethiopia following, conflict in South Sudan, genocide in South Sudan. Like, for 40 years, people have been living in these refugee camps, and none of these people showed up to feed them. So I kind of struggle with who we pick and choose to care about.
Alex, anything else you want to ask Nicole?
I just wanted to say how great this has been. It's been a fantastic episode. Thank you so much for it. I'm gonna look forward with great interest to listening to your future podcasts, and you've been an absolutely super guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.